Hello, good evening everyone. Welcome to the Whitechapel Gallery. My name's Richard Martin. I'm the Daskanopoulos Director of Education and Public Programmes here at the Gallery, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this panel discussion entitled Terra, Firma, the Politics of Earth. And it's lovely to see all of you here in the auditorium, and a special welcome to all our audiences watching on the live stream. Tonight's event is part of our public programmes series called Ways of Knowing, which explores alternative ways of thinking about the world, asking questions about what we know and how we come to know it. And for our Ways of Knowing season this autumn, we've been focusing on questions of earth and matter. And we've been particularly inspired by Theaster Gates' incredible exhibition here at the gallery called A Clay Sermon. And Theaster's show is open until the 9th of January. It's free, and I hope you all have the chance to see it if you haven't already. Tonight, we're going to be thinking about the multiple political, cultural, and social meanings of Earth. And I'm delighted that we have 4 brilliant contributors with us this evening to share their thoughts and their practices. We'll be hearing short presentations from the artist, Phoebe Collings-James, from the theorist, Kathryn Yusoff, and from the organic grower and writer, Claire Ratinon. And our discussion this evening is chaired by the artist and curator, Angela Chan. And I want to thank all of our contributors for taking the time to be here with us this evening. There will also be a chance for all of you to ask questions and to join the conversation. And if I can ask that you wait for the microphone to arrive before that magic moment appears, and that would be especially appreciated so that our digital audiences can also hear your contribution. Finally, a quick word on the COVID-related precautions that we're taking this evening. So as you'll see, we're at reduced capacity tonight to allow for more social distancing. And if you're comfortable wearing a mask, then we'd encourage you to do so. Otherwise, I hope you all enjoy the evening. Thank you so much for being here. And please join me in welcoming Phoebe Collings-James, Kathryn Yusoff, Claire Ratinon, and first of all, Angela Chan.
Thank you everyone for joining this evening. Really glad that you can make it both in person and online. I'm Angela, and I'm super excited to have this gentle sharing with our invited guests. And we're going to kind of like take ourselves through some of the presentations by our guests, and have a very kind of, as I said, gentle sharing of questions that we've kind of been thinking about as a response to the exhibition, and some of the themes that have come up as well with the brief of this session. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce to our first speaker, Phoebe Collings-James, whose work often eludes linear retellings of stories. Instead, her works function as emotional detritus. They speak of knowledges of feelings, the debris of violence, language, and desire, which are inherent to living and surviving within hostile environments. Recent works have been dealing with the object as subject, giving life and tension to ceramic forms. As of 2021, freelance ceramic fellow, as the 2021 freelance ceramic fellow, she has an upcoming exhibition at Camden Arts Centre, London, in autumn 2021. Collings-James's Mudbelly Ceramic Studio began as a personal practice and research outlet, but has since grown to encompass a shop and a teaching facility offering free ceramics courses for Black people in London, taught by Black ceramicists. What a biography. Really looking forward to your sharing, and so over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here and excited for this conversation. When thinking about where to start, I was going to begin with when I first started making ceramics, when I first started working with clay, and sculpture, but I thought maybe actually it's one of the first times I was really starting to think about clay, even though I might not have even had words yet, was in my garden as a kid. And I had one of those like quite iconic Fisher-Price cookers that might be quite familiar to people. And I was really excited about it. Maybe I was, I don't know, 5 or 6. And I dragged it out into the garden, which kind of was a little bit of a dystopian garden. It was very small and unruly. And I dragged it to the back and basically spent all of my time there for years, making mud pies, cooking stuff, building stuff, and often naked or naked with a coat and wellies. And yeah, I guess I kind of like started to remember that in thinking about this conversation with the earth, because then when I did actually end up starting to work with ceramics and firing clay when I was sort of in my early 20s on a residency, I think there was probably some of the same energy of sort of like wonder and excitement and a feeling of connection to the earth that was very sort of like visceral. And then, yeah, so behind me is some of my work, which is just going to flick through, which sort of goes from some of my earliest exhibitions, working with both sort of wheel-thrown and hand-built forms. But yeah, what do I want to say? So I started working with ceramics and kind of, I guess I was encouraged, excited by the way that I was able to sort of like have a dialogue with clay as a material, and one that felt very reciprocal and full of a lot of unknowns at the same time as a lot that was sort of very familiar, very bodily, very sort of metaphorically and spiritually kind of connected. But I think in terms of like thinking around where I'm at now and some of the dialogues that I've sort of been in or been privy to in terms of how ceramics works as an industry, how I am involved in it, whether it's thinking about like the pottery kind of boom of sort of that sort of connects to quite like a neoliberal sense of like people's feeling that they deserve and sort of like have a right to pleasure and leisure, and how those things translate. Sorry, I might be like jumping around a bit, but sort of like I guess I started learning how to throw in these kind of like very sort of like shared workspaces that were for profit. They had sort of replaced old sort of college systems of learning, and they were now, you know, pottery studios posed as something very holistic, and maybe they were, you know, somewhat holistic and enjoyable spaces, but they were definitely only for like one kind of class of person, often one race of person, and I guess there was like a capitalist interest in there, which I felt at odds with the experience I was having in my dialogue with the clay and with my ambitions for it, and then the sort of like wider ecosystem that I was observing. Anyway, those are many things. I'm sure we'll get into them. But I wanted to read a couple of paragraphs from this book, which you'll probably find in the library here still. And it's a conversation between Etel Adnan, who sadly died earlier this week, and her partner Simone Fattal. And yeah, I'm just going to read to you. Simone, of course, when you work with Earth, you're in contact with what is most basic and universal. We have all come out of this clay, you, me, all of us. To work with Earth is to rediscover it, converse with it, as Earth is something living. It's a living material which allows us to make a pot or a sculpture from it. It's what makes it transformable. It's marvelous. It's a dialogue with life. It's a dialogue. It's a living dialogue. It imposes its own life. and then et al. We see, once again, how what's natural has been divorced from what's artificial. Natural dyes are pitted against chemical dyes, yet all chemicals are derived from the natural world. Everything is in some way natural. As Simone just said, God in our religions created man from earth. Among all the elements used in the arts, clay is, mythologically speaking, the most important and primal. Clay played an important role in the creation. The earliest creation myth is Sumerian. When we speak of myths, we note that the world was born in Iraq, a land of mud and clay. Additionally, all expression is dependent on material. Otherwise, thought remains enclosed within itself, within the individual spirit. For a writer, the material is words. So yeah, those are some sentences that I kind of wanted to bring into this conversation. And maybe the last thing I'll say is just thinking about a question on like what is natural and how they've used it in those in that conversation, and also how we might think about it in our conversation.
Thank
Yeah,
you,
I'm gonna stop there.
Phoebe.
Thank you.
That's fantastic. And those are really beautiful choices of sentences that you shared as well. And we'll come back to them in the question and discussion section of our kind of sharing as well. And I'll move on now to Kathryn, and to introduce everyone if you're not already aware. Kathryn Yusoff is Professor of Inhuman Geography in the School of Geography at Queen Mary University of London. Her research examines how inhuman and non-organic materialities have consequences for how we understand issues of environmental change, race, and subjectivity. Most recently, she is the author of A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, Minneapolis University of Minnesota Press, 2018. Her forthcoming book, Geologic Life, Inhuman Intimacies, and the Geophysics of Race, addresses the histories or geology and the gravities of race. Over to you, Kathryn. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation. It's really nice to be here. I just work up the streets at Queen Mary, but I've never been in the Whitechapel. Well, I mean, on a stage in the Whitechapel. But so it's really nice to be here. And thank you for your reflections on kind of the earth and broken grounds. I was just going to sort of just say a little bit about the work that I've been doing recently in the sort of context of the sort of artifact of Earth. And I've been kind of writing a sort of long history of geology that is about colonial Earths. And it's about thinking about what the Earth remembers and what it forgets, and how that's kind of scribed or written into cultural memory. So if we think about colonialism as a form of geotrauma, a form of breaking Earths, a form of kind of broken grounds, and this tying together of geologic formations and race in what I've been calling white geology. So it's a very specific form of grammaring the Earth, of bringing the Earth into a set of discourses and practices that transform the Earth, but also kind of make extinct other kinds of possibilities. So one of the questions that I've really been kind of trying to grapple with is what kinds of reparations and repair and remembering can be thought with and in the Earth. So it's really nice to share this panel with practitioners that are involved in that thinking with the kind of very intimacies of the Earth. So I've been thinking about the Earth as a kind of both a product of racialized relations, so the sort of outcome of racialized relations from 1492 and through the history of slavery, enslavement and through to kind of neo-colonial development models. But also, so thinking about it as this medium, but also a kind of geophysical product, so an artifact of those relations. So the world we have now, the Earth we have now as the Anthropocene, is the kind of artifact of that long history of colonial relations with the Earth. So if we want to sort of find another future, we also need to find another Earth. So part of thinking about this is thinking about the Earth as a kind of contingent space of possibility that gives this kind of iterative testimony of those geotraumas that are kind of written into the Earth. But it's also this kind of open interstitial space of possibility for different kinds of futurity. And if we think about kind of, you know, in COP, we've recently seen kind of colonial Earth on display in the sort of cars, carbon, coal, natural resource extraction model of the Earth. And against that, there is this kind of missing Earth, which I think is about as a sort of the black and brown archive of the Earth, of all those kind of relations that are suppressed and kind of made extinct through that extraction model of the Earth. So one of the questions for us as a geographer and someone located within geosciences is what kind of Earth can we produce? How can we learn and think with different forms of intimacy with the Earth that create a different possibility or a different futurity? So the work that I've been doing is very kind of historical, geographical, and trying to map these colonial Earths, but also trying to map the racialized relations that are produced through this Earth. And so how is it that we actually have a very material geophysics of race, an anti-black gravity that lands on certain bodies and certain persons repeatedly in a very kind of physical way. So not necessarily thinking about sort of metaphors of anti-black gravities, but actually thinking about how is the material history of these gravities constructed and maintained. And part of that kind of maintaining of pressure, of kind of anti-black and gravities happens through natural resources, happens through this kind of adherence to a colonial Earth. So this is kind of some of the kind of ideas that I've been thinking with. And in the book, A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, which was specifically around the kind of scripting of origin stories for the Anthropocene, was really just kind of looking at how geology and colonialism are co-constituted. And what kinds of languages do we need to kind of rift apart that relation that is so embedded in the normative ways in which we understand materiality. So maybe I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Kathryn. So many terms that I feel just, yes, really speak to us all, and we'll kind of come back to them so that we can start to unpack them together as well. Thank you for that sharing. And so I move on to Claire. Claire, sorry, my notes have kind of gone. Claire Ratinon is an organic food grower and writer based in East Sussex. Claire has grown edible plants in a variety of roles, from growing organic vegetables for the Otterlengi restaurant, to delivering growing workshops throughout London to audiences including primary schools, community centres and corporate clients. She has been invited to share her growing journey and experiences in talks and workshops for organisations, including the Garden Museum, the Royal College of Art and West Dean College, as well as having presented features for Radio 4's Gardeners' Question Time. Her writing has been featured in The New Statesman, Bloom magazine and Waitrose magazine. She co-wrote a pamphlet entitled Horticultural Appropriation for Rough Trade with artist Sam Eyre, and her first book, How to Grow Your Dinner Without Leaving the House, is out now. Claire, over to you. Thank you.
After you two, it makes me sound like a cartoon character. It sounds so goofy in that bio.
What a bio, please.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honour to share the stage with all of you. So, and thank you for your sharing. I don't know how I'm supposed to follow you, Kathryn, but yeah, I mean, I suppose where to start. I have been growing for, I think this is probably about 9 years now, and I had a whole life before I came to the earth. I came to plants. I used to work in television and film and in the media, and yeah, 9 years ago when I was living in New York, I found my way to this rooftop farm in the middle of the city, and my life pivoted. I found this profound and deep passion for working with my hands, working with the soil, and growing plants that feed people. And so yeah, I mean, I could very easily go into the journey of how I came to be growing plants, but I think it's probably more pertinent to talking about the politics of earth, of how I've ended up talking about and conceptualizing my own work in the more kind of recent years. And so after I was in New York for a few years growing with this rooftop farm, I came to London and started to retrain, and that was in 2016. So I was training to grow food organically under the shadow of the kind of conversations around Brexit, and so there was this kind of, you know, this incredible thing that was happening in my life where I was suddenly finding something that felt so. It was such a visceral practice that felt so. I mean, it felt quite earnest. It was very, very. You know, it's hard work. It's really hard labour, but it felt like the most integrity I've ever had is with turning away from a career in media and turning towards the earth. But I was doing this at the same time as these conversations around immigration were happening, around our identity as a nation, to which I have a troubled sense of belonging, and you know, whether we are going to be in or out of the EU, what does that mean, and who gets to call themselves British or whatever. And so, you know, these two things were happening at the same time, and I felt that I couldn't grow in the way that so many other people, particularly if you're looking at the kind of mainstream world of horticulture, which is very white, very middle class, quite banal, honestly. I felt like I couldn't actually engage in the work of growing whilst trying to remain apolitical, as it were. You know, I was growing in the city, I was growing on these like pockets of land that, and it's a radical thing to grow plants on land in a city where, you know, people are desperate to grow blocks of flats, if only, to build on those pieces of land. You know, that land is valued highly, and so to do something like that is so undervalued as the work of growing the plants that feed us in these spaces felt inherently political, and so a lot of this stuff was kind of percolating in my own mind and percolating within conversations amongst peers, and so I have found myself kind of drawn into thinking about the act of growing, what that means as somebody who is, who has a racial identity in a country that colonized my ancestors, and to do so in this land where I have a troubled relationship is just something I couldn't do without kind of entering into the dialogue of the meaning of that work, the history of that work, and that meant looking, for me, at the kind of colonial histories of agriculture and horticulture, and the way in which those things are not historical. They are very much imbued in not only the very practicalities of working the land being, you know, a way of accumulating power and wealth and maintaining it and hoarding it, but then also the practices themselves, particularly if you look at a practice like horticulture, which is, I would argue, an embodied performance of like coloniality, and that is the argument I sort of make in the pamphlet that I co-wrote for Rough Trade, which is called Horticultural Appropriation, and yeah, the argument, well, that pamphlet came about because I wrote it. the artist Samo is my partner, and it came out of the conversations we were kind of having over the kitchen table, because he is an artist. He actually used to work at the Whitechapel, and we were talking about this idea of like decolonization, which is worth pointing out that is a troublesome use of the word to use this in intellectual pursuits, when decolonization is in itself a very real thing that has to happen in particularly settler colonial states. That's referencing an essay by Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang called "Decolonization is Not a Metaphor." I say that because it's worth noting that decolonization is a real practice, and so I use that word mindfully. But we were talking about this idea of like decolonizing our institutions, and like what are our institutions doing in order to at least engage in the conversations around decolonizing their collections, and what horticulture might learn from that endeavor. And I think there's a lot that horticulture can learn using kind of decolonial lens to look at the practices, because the plants came here as part of the colonial project, and along those same routes people were moved and exploited and extracted from, and those narratives, that lineage is not something that is in the past. It is very much living in our gardens to this day, and I think that there's no way that we can interact with the earth, grow plants in the way that maybe the horticultural establishment would prefer, that is without politics inherently imbued in the physical act and the theoretical act. I mean, I could just do this all day. I'm really sorry. But yes, I mean, I think we'll actually get on to a couple of other things. But there's a huge amount to kind of literally unearth when we talk about the act of horticulture and the act of agriculture as well. Particularly as it mirrors the kind of erasure that has happened in other aspects. I'm sure that's really true in a number of art practices, probably in clay making and clay work, and the work in the gallery now. You know, there's a huge amount of erasure that happens, and horticulture is really guilty of that, because everybody would prefer it to be a beautiful aesthetic practice, and it's not. It's actually it's got a bloody history, and I think we ought to be engaging with that, because for some people, for me, it doesn't feel like an option to try and decouple those two things. And so that's why I've ended up being somebody who both does the practice of growing plants, but then also wants to excavate some of those histories that have been intentionally invisibilized in order to create this like nice sanitized world of flower shows and, you know, and a plethora of hideous practices within those things, and to kind of maintain this like colonial performance, as opposed to being really truthful about what it all really represents, which I believe is a richer practice. Sorry, that's probably over my time, isn't it?
No, we're great for time, and we'll have even more time now for discussion as well, cool. Because there's so many things that are already overlapping across the things that you have each discussed. And I guess like bringing it back to Theaster Gates' exhibition, A Clay Sermon, there's a really great podcast that's also online on the website to listen to, and part of it, the artist also says that through clay, it's almost as if the practice is learning how to shape worlds. And so this has also come about in each of your own activities, in the way that you've come to the ways that you're thinking about earth or land or, you know, material, in your own lifetimes, but also in this geologic time that you're working with as well, or intersecting with or learning about. And so, I want to touch upon the ways that you've been describing how matter has been a way to express, a way to find language, a way to find yourself in relation to environments as well, and how you've come to kind of sense the world or shape the world through the materials that you've been working with. So maybe to expand on those kind of thoughts that you've already begun to share with us, and speak a little bit more about. I really loved, Phoebe, about how you brought up the gasp. you know, the experience that you've had as a child, you know, with your Fisher-Price kind of cooker outside, because I did the same. I also had plastic kind of toy cutlery and little bowls where I would scoop up the earth and the clay in my back garden, where it's, you know, the behind the garden it's just fields, and so the kind of the earth in that area is this really super red clay, and I would also make
Midlands, you said?
yeah. I would also make my mud pies and decorate them with daisies, and that was my kind of interaction with the earth that I you know, craved every morning at the weekends. And so that's also, when I remember that, I remember the touch of it being so cold as well, you know, and that sensory kind of activity of digging something up and knowing that it's got a lot of history, Kathryn, the way that you talk about this matter being, you know, enveloped in facts and history, and it's material. It's not just, you know, an object without any connotations at all. And so just to think about holding, you know, with our hands and being in relation to the environment. I just want to hear a bit more about how you come to this in your activities.
Maybe I'll say something. I guess one thing I wanted to highlight, locate, is the fact that the kind of clay that we're talking about that I imagine Theaster has used and that I definitely use in my studio, that it's mined and sort of constructed. It often has like a number of elements in it. It's not, it's sort of, it's gone through a number of processes to make it the kind of, both have the energy and the literal makeup of the earth, but also being something that can be used and fired to particular temperatures and maybe used on the wheel or for hand building, or, you know, it's kind of like it's constructed. And that's sort of one thing. And then I guess like something that has come up for me in terms of trying to sort of like find language around my practice and how I'm thinking about clay and the earth is that there's often a lot of maybe like overzealous essentialism in relation to speaking about clay. People often sort of have this like experience of, oh, I feel so connected to the earth. And that can maybe convey something that's quite one-dimensional in terms of its sort of like purity or something, or like it being a completely, like, again, natural, this idea of something being natural, a natural experience, which is something I like kind of understand, but I guess what I find resonant is the fact that the clay and the clay that I'm using, it sort of has a multitude of sort of histories, I guess, and it's how it exists in the present, which are like toxic, relate to industry, also relate to things which are natural, which I guess is what came out of this excerpt. And all of those things relate to something about our sort of like present experience and Anthropocene. And yeah, I guess I just maybe just wanted to note about it kind of like not being one-dimensional in terms of being, I guess, maybe like a binary of good and bad, and that like because it has origins in the earth, it is natural, it is immediately like good. I think that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah,
but
yeah, definitely.
And I mean, those origin stories are super important for how we kind of script that matter and where it's sort of, how we understand it sort of functioning in the world. I mean, one of the things that I've been really interested in, which I think relates to what you're talking about, is around kind of thinking about the ghosts of geology. So, like, what are the kind of forms of embodiment and subjectivity that live within but are not necessarily represented in the archive. So Maybe if we have the ghosts of geology, we also have the ghosts of botany and the kind of like, economic botany and that role in sort of plantations and so on. But really thinking about what this kind of flesh of geology kind of sets up in terms of subjectivity, in terms of like our understanding of relation to the earth. And I mean, the bricks, for example, in Gates's exhibition, and the brick is the kind of most sort of like overlooked and sort of autonomous material that you could probably, but each brick is different, and each kind of, and we tend to think about sort of materials as kind of autonomous things, and rather than kind of necessarily the history, that we're, in terms of steel and metal and modernity and so on, we're encouraged to always think about them as autonomous sort of designed architectures. But if we begin to think about the kind of effective architectures that have brought them to that place, the Caribbean writer Amy Césaire says, "See my heel print on every skyscraper," and like to see that colonial history in the production of modernity, and to see the kind of the prints on a brick, on a kind of which I think maybe relates to kind of understanding these kind of long and deep histories of plants and of kind of forms of economic and colonial botany.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that you could potentially pick up from there. But you're thinking about like that notion of legacy when you're looking at plants. I think because of the nature of their life cycle, the erasure it happens quite readily. There's because we talk about one of the things in the pamphlet we talk about is the idea of reparations, and like what that might look like. Like when you're looking at art institutions, I feel like the potential for reparations or repair, and the solutions come more readily when a very physical object has been extracted from a space and persists and exists in that space and could be returned. Whereas if you're looking at something that is like a plant that is a living thing that has a lineage and that has continuity through time, but the notion of reparations kind of becomes like troubled by this idea of like not having like a valuable item that you can then go on and return, and what that looks like. And so I find that really interesting, the idea of like being able to see that footprint on this solidified thing. Whereas I think when I look at my garden, when I look at anyone's garden, I see those footprints in every single one of those plants, without so many of those journeys having been taken place with people who were allegedly plant hunting and discovering, and actually they were just extracting and stealing. And often, it would be fetishized as spice espionage or something like that, whereas actually it was just, it was pure, unadulterated, like pillage. Our gardens wouldn't look the way that they look now. Our landscape wouldn't look the way that it looks now if it weren't for the colonial project having reshaped both the landscape here and the landscapes in spaces where plantation economy is decimated. Ecosystems in order to create this extractive system that fed this, fed the Western world effectively. Yes, I feel like I've drifted quite far away from the original question.
Can we ask each other questions?
Yeah, of course.
I guess maybe I want to say two things. One is that you're talking about the bricks, and it just made me think of the Dave the Potter pot, in terms of thinking about like slave, industry and slaves making pottery, and like how and when we are aware of like when who those artifacts were made by, when we are able to visibly see those footprints, and then also wondering about pharmaceuticals. Like it just makes me think about this direct line between like stealing the plants and then colonizing the plants via sort of deciding who can have access to them ultimately via medicine.
Absolutely. Well, because indigenous wisdom was completely one of the many extracted aspects. It wasn't just the physical plants themselves, but it was the knowledge that was taken from those communities that then, feeds a lot of the medicines that we have today. And I mean that is not again, not a particularly historical process. That there is evidence that's fairly recently, and I believe there are certain people who are engaging in projects where they are looking at reparations within that kind of model. But yeah, a lot of the medicine that we lean on has been is part of that extractive system. It's really true. And to kind of build on what you just shared, there is an enormous amount of erasure of who plants were grown by, the botanists who were also enslaved people, who were plant experts. I wish I could remember who said this quote, but so forgive me for not citing appropriately, but someone did say, we weren't enslaved because we were enslaved because we were so good at cultivating. It was like this idea that enslaved Africans were actually incredible, land stewards and plants people, and that was one of the reasons why the system worked so well, and so grotesquely, obviously, but worked so effectively, was because we were so damn good at growing, and I mean, part of my own practice is reclaiming that sense of as opposed to it being a labour that is only drenched in trauma, but that we grew before that system was put into place, and that to grow as the descendant of that system, I am reclaiming that, that practice, and so it is really important for me to at least and know full well that I may never find the story of an ancestor who, I know I will never find the story of an ancestor. I don't have any stories of my ancestors, but to know inherently in my bloodline there will have been plants people, and I am honouring that legacy, because otherwise the legacy of land stewardship and the legacy of working with plants only belongs to the slave trade. I don't want that. And yeah, I feel like there's connectivity about kind of reclaiming space as the experts in our field, or the practitioners in our field, and it not necessarily having to only sit in that one traumatic story.
In terms of thinking about what you were saying about decolonising work being active, what are the active things that you do that you feel are maybe different to how other people might be working with horticulture?
That's a good question. I don't really know. It's a really. I think
not that research and thinking is not
right,
active,
and I think that's it. I think is just honesty is it's engaging in these dialogues and actually asking these questions. I think it ends up being that, I've done talks before and been in spaces where the question always comes back. It's just what does a decolonial garden look like? I'm just I can't write a manual. It's not about you can't just I can't just write a how-to book that tells you how to do it right. It's about dialogues. It's about addressing erasure. It's about reweaving together these stories that pushed us to the sidelines or made us only, fixed assets or whatever. It's a really good question, and I don't know if I know how to answer it, other than I think there's something inherently radical about daring to move into an industry, a sector, or whatever that is very invested in maintaining their sanitized version of doing things and troubling it and persistently troubling it. And I don't think everyone likes it, and I think that's probably a sign that I'm doing the right thing.
Yeah, it's that agency to define your own parameters of what that would look like, what decolonisation means to you. And, across our works, I feel like the act of self-archiving is something that's really important, not only to recognise that a lot of our histories are in the margins, or they have not been even written, or they've been written but actively erased. All of these calculated strategies to diminish cultures and to continue the imperialist and colonial quest is something that, in talking about our own histories and knowing it inside out, but on top of that, also being able to find our own languages and vocabularies and, you know, grammar to articulate what that story could actually be framed as for, you know, our descendants is really important. So I think, you know, in both, you know, in all of your presentations, there's been these hints towards finding language, not necessarily in spoken form, but through the creation of, you know, material, or through the creation of spaces, that I think is really important. And I guess, like, just to return to what you were saying, Claire, earlier about, you used this phrase of like the colonial performance, and I felt that really resonates a lot when you see the way that planting or growing, when you this activity actually takes a lot of nurturing, and it can be misunderstood that if you're nurturing something to grow to its most I guess like flourished form, you're doing something good. And it goes back to the binary of like, if it's just natural, does that, you know, does that give the good and bad binary? And the answer is not, because the power struggle still exists. No matter how much you know, care and love you put into that plant, the legacy of its history is not something that has been, you know, eradicated through that process. You can't erase that. It's within the soil. It's within the roots. So yeah, that's something that I wanted to respond to in terms of the colonial performance that you brought up, which was, yeah, really, really interesting.
Before you go to your next point, can I get my hat? It's
yeah,
actually colder than I imagined. Can you get it for me? It's just a lot.
We're kind of talking about kind of parameters and thinking about what borders are surrounding us. There's this air vents that is kind of giving us a slow iceberg.
I think it's missing.
So I'm gently shivering at the moment. And this chair is like a rocking chair, so it's a very active engagement here.
Thank you.
I wanted to speak a bit more about this like missing earth, that, you know, speaking about this self-archiving that I think runs quite a lot in my own practice, and I wanted to sense out how it works for you all as well. This kind of like this missing earth, this missing archive. I'd invite you to talk a bit more about it and how we can expand it also to our individual activities and share on that.
I mean, the way I've been thinking about it is that there's this kind of missing earth that also kind of supports this kind of colonial earth. You know, it's not that the earth is missing in terms of its sort of erasure, but it's also very present because it's the very thing that actually produces the kind of colonial earth, right? So the racialized undergrounds that support the kind of like surfaces and the production and the, you know, the skills of the potters, the metallurgists, the planters and so on, that actually, you know, kind of built kind of the kind of colonial project. So it's kind of missing but also hiding in plain sight. So I think there's this kind of, you know, there's a doubling of a kind of black earth there, of a kind of an earth that supports the very possibility of a colonial earth, but also is kind of is erased consistently in terms of kind of the sort of representation and possibility of that earth. And so for me, it's about how you intervene in that archive. And part of that is just kind of mapping that archive and mapping the way in which particularly black and brown subjects come into geology's archive. And they're there in the footnotes in the production of race, they're there in the kind of, so they're kind of, the earth is missing, but it's also, you know, it's like a shadow earth almost of these kind of ghosts of geology that are kind of, but are not given a sort of space of testimony or a space of kind of remembrance and reparation and so on. So what does it mean to shift the perspectivism when you bring those ghosts right out into the kind of, into the apex of, that you get a very different sort of account of time and space. And I think, it's also about kind of in thinking with the materiality and with the kind of earth, about also how you release different kind of durational possibilities, that actually working, and working with materiality in different kinds of ways produces a different sense, organization of time and space. And that's a kind of crucial, having different kind of scripts of temporality is a crucial kind of weapon, I think, in the sort of defeat of colonial earth, in a sense, is actually being able to, because time is also what maps kind of futurity and maps kind of certain kinds of trajectories and organizes certain kinds of origin stories. So the kind of missing earth is also a missing time, or a kind of out of timeness, a kind of broken earth, but also kind of broken trajectories, broken sort of genealogical trajectories, particularly in enslavement and all the forms of forced migration that we currently live with in our kind of hostile environments.
And to add to that, notion of temporality, a lot of these history textbooks, they seem to have this full stop, the end of chapter, close the book, whereas we do forget quite often these are unfinished histories, and I try to amplify this quite a lot in my work, and I understand that you also do, each of you, saying that these are very much continuing into our daily lives right now. This is why it's so important not only to reframe the histories that have happened, but make sure that the present day histories in the making are framed in the ways that actually do justice to the people who have always been minoritized and marginalized and so on, so that there is a better foundation for future generations to start writing history. So I think the way that thinking about or rethinking time is a very important strategy, even in these activities.
And I think a lot about the who does the writing, and who has the voice, who has the agency, who has the power in those dynamics. And so my family are from Mauritius, and it is I don't know if it might be just because there's not a lot in the English language, and maybe there's more in French, but I've struggled to find histories and that are, well, all the histories are told by the victors effectively, but even so, I still struggle to find comprehensive histories in ways that other nations have access to archives. I don't know whether they were destroyed or whether they exist in the first place. And there's only a couple of books that I found my way to, and so I think that there's almost, for me, there's a role of disrupting the supremacy of the history's academia. There's a what makes a historian, what makes somebody who has the right to tell a history or right to tell a story, and to assume that they are telling that history apolitically or apolitically and without advantage is illogical to me. And I know that there's a whole pushback, there's a whole culture war around this idea of who gets to tell the histories, and whether we are even allowed to dare to look at them again and to ask what is missing, what is erased, what is silenced, what is invisibilized. And for me personally, it's a really important project. It's just a personal project to be able to find what I can and extrapolate from that which is missing. And even just participating in these kinds of conversations, my qualification is I am qualified in growing plants. I just happen to have a brain that is desperate for these stories and hungry for these disruptive dialogues, and so I invest my energy into the research around that and the conversations around that, and so in a way my presence in even this space, or I did a talk a month ago with the Royal Botanical Gardens in Edinburgh, and just my presence in the fact that I was invited to share what is ultimately an opinion with an institution that is so colonial and so established and such a huge part of the colonial project, both past and present, was in itself disruptive. And so I think it's also having conversations about whose voices, perspectives, stories we privilege, and what can we do in order to amplify those pockets of silence that are throughout all of our histories. Even like the histories that have been written are just rich white men's histories, and then how they observe the rest of humanity.
Also an OPED.
Yeah.
Also an OPED.
Yeah. And in fact, I was talking to a friend today who's a chef who talks about kind of the way the recipes that you would have had from only a few hundred years ago were not what normal people were eating. They don't include foraged food. They do not include all the kind of offcuts of whatever animal was slaughtered. So all the recipes you have from like the 1600s are just like swans and a bird stuck in a bird stuck in a bird stuck in a bird, and it's like, there's so much even within on this land. The erasure is profound here. This is not just something that was exported to the colonies that were then kind of reshaped, reformed, deforested, decimated in order to feed this like hungry colonial project. This happened on this land too. The erasure exists here, and we've got to figure out how we fill some of those silences, I think, and maybe just like dismantling this hierarchy of who gets to tell those tales, who gets to tell those histories is a step towards that.
Yeah, and those systemic structures were exported from this land. This is the original.
This is the mothership.
And I feel like, when we're talking about the production of knowledge, a lot of it that I find really necessary is to deconstruct the criteria of expertise that allows people to actually have engagement, but also the agency to feel like they're worth listening to, and not only that, but worth writing their own stories and writing themselves into histories. So that criteria might be, something that's related to academic expertise, or kind of like, qualifications that make society take you more seriously. But what I really advocate is that lived experience itself is enough for people to say that this is real. This is a very authentic piece of knowledge that deserves to be understood and kind of discussed quite widely. And I kind of face this quite a lot because I work in the overlaps of the arts and climate change. And this is something that a lot of people feel that they don't have access to, or they don't have the authority to even engage with. The arts is, historically very elitist. Climate change is something, the whole discourse is, still dominant, is very dominant by the global north narrative, which excludes a lot of indigenous, black and POC experiences. So to kind of, contend with both of those as a parallel, you recognise that, this is kind of a setup of the same templates of systemic injustices that make it very difficult, because there are so many barriers that set it as, very, very kind of challenging to forefront lived and authentic experiences. And so I wanted to kind of ask you to speak a little bit more about how, with Mudbelly, engaging with like people just through making, I think is very powerful, and growing together. The book that you have out, How to Grow Without Leaving Your Home. Tell us more about it, and this is something that I'd love to hear more about.
I wanted to say something actually before that. Just about like there being potentially resistance to this sort of like going back into histories and geologies and kind of like interrogating them. But ultimately, I think more and more people are finding that they're going to be forced to do that, and they are being forced to do that. I even heard the other day on the radio about a botanical garden in Scotland that is that they've turned the power off, and they've decided to ultimately decolonize it. I can't remember if they were using that language or not, but they were basically realised it wasn't sustainable environmentally, and then they were also having to do the work of asking themselves why it was there in the first place. And likewise, thinking about the places that are being hit most in terms of like places like the Caribbean, where there's like, hurricanes, flooding, someone who knows a mangrove, someone knows like sort of like natural resources for flood defense. Those are the people who didn't need to go to sort of university to understand how those things inherently protect, housed communities. So I think, those things just popped into my head as you were talking. I don't know how ceramics classes are really like doing much, but I guess, I guess in terms of sort of like pedagogies and learning and education, I think creating spaces in which education can be free, where sort of like learned systems are being questioned, sort of like a question of like what makes a certain learning environment accessible is something that I've thought about a lot, knowing that, so I have Mudbelly, which is both a place for me to sort of like make pottery and kind of like indulge that interest, and also a space where I get funding to do free ceramics classes for Black people. Originally, so far it's been in London, and I teach, and I also invite other Black ceramicists and artists to teach on the courses. And I guess I've thought a lot about like kind of what makes that space accessible, and a lot of it is economic, but there are also other reasons in terms of like the spaces that are currently available in cities are in newly gentrified areas, and they are, for many different reasons, sort of like impenetrable in terms of who, with all the signifiers that sort of like you have as an institution or as an organisation, they seem like unavailable and unwelcome, and are mostly populated with white middle class people who have like, I guess, a lot of money. So was that answering kind of what you were getting at?
Is there anything that you'd like to add to that?
Do you mind repeating the question?
How does it work for you to kind of open up, I guess, the sharing of knowledge, and using that as like a way to shape the new kinds of experiences and ethics and worlds that you want to see? Yeah, well, like, since moving to the countryside, rather ironically, I do less growing in order to feed people, and have sort of ended up kind of pivoting into doing more writing and speaking about it. And I've always, I mean, if you grow in a city, there's very few jobs where you can actually turn up at the same place and grow every day. It's a very poorly paid profession, so you end up having to kind of pivot from job to job to job. And a lot of my job has ended up being like working as a school gardener or delivering workshops, and so that has always been a kind of core part of my work. And now it looks more like writing and writing my book about it. And I do I mean the reason why the book with its ludicrous title that came out in the middle of the pandemic, but it's the focus on it is growing edible plants in containers, and the reason why I did that was because I thought that it was the most
accessible approach that someone could take to learning the principle of raising a plant from a seed and harvesting from it. And it came out of seeing or sensing how transformative learning this process was for myself, and wanting to share that possibility with as many people as possible. And land is capital, isn't it? Land is power, and land is an asset in this country. And so many people don't have access to even. I mean, when I started growing in London, I didn't even have a windowsill wide enough to put a pot on. I had to go and grow in other people's spaces. I had to go and find somewhere else that someone else was growing, so that I could participate in that process. And I just knew there was bound to be lots of other people who might have a balcony if they were lucky, or a front door, porch, or or something. And I just wanted to create that book as a way of encouraging people to grow whatever they could in whatever space they possibly had. And I still maintain that it is a very transformative thing to learn how to do. It's very humbling. It is simple, but it is not easy. And it is. Yeah, I think it's a prism through which we can really understand what it takes to feed us and to uphold us all. Like, we all thrive on this system that is yet another thing that is invisibilized within kind of our society as something that is lowly and of little value, when we all know that that's not true. Like, we couldn't exist without the people who grow the food that we eat and produce food that we eat. So yeah, I suppose that's how I share knowledge, and we'll continue to keep trying to do that. I think I'm hopefully going to be doing a video course next year with any luck. And then writing. Always writing now.
Amazing. We're staying tuned for the video series. That sounds great. Maybe this is a good time to kind of ask if there's any comments or questions, prioritising questions from the audience.
Only questions.
Only questions. And there's a roving mic as well.
Thank you. Maybe I'll do it like this. Is that okay? Thank you very much, everyone. I wanted to ask the really wonderful panelists about what kind of ways or human or inhuman connections, or just like practices they've found personally helpful for thinking about the future in ways that you find kind of nourishing or generative, considering that I think a lot of what gets said about the future is often in terms of either kind of denying its existence, either in terms of extinction or just as an extension of the present, just more capitalism, right? Or a kind of like quite violent mobilizations by the right, whether that's the kind of Elon Musk in space thing or ecofascism or something else. So yeah, whether that's like types of friendship, types of spaces, things you like reading, fiction or non-fiction, other forms of art, ways of dreaming, anything really that kind of works for you some of the time or for other people. And thanks again.
Thank you, Francis.
Wow.
Francis is a friend and a co-director of the London Science Fiction Research Community.
Awesome.
So we're a team. Would anyone like to open up with a sharing, or?
I was just about to say about speculation, but given that you're the science fiction experts here, I might defer. But I mean, I think the fact that we do live on a contingent Earth is like a very kind of insightful kind of, I mean, it's a very insightful thing for actually kind of building different kinds of Earths and building different kinds of futures. And if, at this kind of particular moment of kind of, the sort of brink of shifting into another kind of version of the Earth, kind of there's also the possibility for that Earth to be, radically different. So, in a sense, the Earth is kind of delivering a lesson in kind of radical epistemology that, it's kind of, I think, has a lot of provocative and, kind of like no small amount of like terrifying possibilities, and I think the work of kind of speculation in inhabiting those possibilities gives us kind of ways to think about. And I just wanted to mention that actually there's one really fantastic South African artist called Noland Oswald Dennis, and he's been running this thing called the Black Earth Study Club. And it's a way of thinking about sort of how you begin to sort of map the Earth differently, or kind of come up with different epistemologies, but through a kind of collaborative, intimate practice of a study group. And I really like the kind of sort of modesty of that proposal, but it's also kind of really giant in its imagination of trying to think about kind of how you interact with the Earth differently.
Wow, that's brilliant.
I mean, my answer's really obvious, isn't it? I'm going to say grow something, always grow something. And I think, despite the fact that I spend my time often talking about horticulture as a kind of colonial descendant, my passion is growing food, and growing food organically specifically. And I mean, there's obviously, well, it's not obvious, but within the world of food growers, there's lots of like tussling around like what words we use about how we grow regeneratively, agroecologically. But when I trained, it was training in organic principles, and the reason why that's so important to me is that having come from like a media career that felt honestly quite wasteful, engaging in practices, particularly like organic practices, where the objective is for you to feed the soil and for you to consistently invest year upon year on feeding that soil and never taking more than you are replenishing. I think I am someone who is very much prone to hopelessness, especially in the context of our climate situation. But I do find that my annual mulch of organic compost on my soil is at least a nod to the fact that I believe that a future will exist. And every time I sow seeds, that is me saying that at least I believe that in 6 months' time, or in 8 months' time, 9 months' time, I'll be there to harvest something. So yeah, grow something.
That the cycle continues.
Yeah. And we're part of it. Like, it will go on without us, but we can also participate in that, and that's a beautiful thing. It's I think, yeah, when things are feeling hopeless, participating in something thriving is a beautiful and hopeful act. It's probably a bit obvious, wasn't it?
There's so much that both of you are saying. I'm just like, one thing I wanted to say is that in relation to that and the two of you, is just that, like, I guess what's important to me is I think more and more people are going to be running from media jobs, I'm working in an art industry, which is also very problematic. People are going to be running from these industries which are like highly toxic, and I guess I'm thinking about how to make sure we don't run from one thing to another, out of the frying pan and into the fire. And in terms of, I guess that's what links like Mudbelly and what I'm trying to do, and maybe failing, who knows, is sort of like trying to think about what I've witnessed in terms of the new sort of like options opening up for people to sort of again go in these sort of like communal studios as a sort of like respite, almost in a very like, I don't know, what I've heard about Silicon Valley style, like, you know, having a massage while you do your capitalism, you know, like that kind of vibe. How to make sure that these things which can be like truly holistic activities and hobbies and whatever don't just turn into more of the same. So in terms of like futurity or whatever, when I think about it, I'm thinking about like how to gain knowledge, conversation, to make sure I can hopefully not contribute to that system. You mentioned intimacy a lot, and I think in lots of different ways, intimacy with our friends, family, environments, the things we eat, the things we consume, is going to be really important, for me, learning more about herbal medicine, things over the last 10 years, foraging and consuming sort of herbal medicines for my own health, and just learning about kind of like different histories has been important. And then also a book by Alice Walker called The Temple of My Familiar is like an oracle in many ways, and yeah, you'd have to get into it to understand why, but it's just beautiful. And I feel like every time I read a page, I'm like, oh, how did she know about all these things in terms of what a future could be? That might be cryptic unless you've read it, but I encourage you to read it.
I was just going to end with the point that the really great sci-fi writer N.K. Jemisin, his book, The Broken Earth Trilogy, if you haven't read it, is fantastic. She always says that you need to speculate responsibly, and so that they, which I think we've been hearing. So,
yeah, definitely. And I think that's also something that I would kind of respond to that question with. It's kind of like we can't think about futures without an accountability to the past and the histories. And so it's a privilege to imagine a future, or even the present. The present doesn't exist for many people at the moment. And to understand our histories in the most transparent, most responsible way is doing justice to the futures that we want to live in. And I think, yeah, that quote that you shared from N.K. Jemisin is really powerful. And I think having enough of those counter-narratives that we all actually have through our lived experiences, and the research and the archival work that we're, constantly digging up through our daily practices, those are adding to a resistance against a hegemonic narrative that always seeks to be the singular dominant one that's archived on the government's website. And so it's maintaining those narratives in the plural sense. Do we have any other questions? Yes, at the back.
Hi, thank you for all of your insight. I have a question sort of regarding like working with young people. I was listening to a podcast on like eco-anxiety and all this idea of hopelessness that you were talking about. And I was wondering, Claire, working with young people, something that surprised me in the podcast was that somebody said like they wish they would have learned, so this kind of demand for better knowledge about climate change in schools, and they wish they would learn better skills. And one of them actually said to be able to grow their own food or to be able to do things like that. And that's kind of going back to what you said, Phoebe, about all this knowledge that people who are facing climate change in the global south are doing every day that people in the north are ignoring. I'm wondering what your experience was, if you ever found, like during your workshops or in your time with schools, if kids valued it for that reason, or even if it was just for kind of giving them a sense of hope. And if you think that that could be a good resource for people to implement in schools, and kind of also teaching about all of this, the history of geology and capitalism and how we've kind of ended up in this spot and what they can do to create new futures.
It's a big question. I mean, take everything I say under the umbrella of the Tory government we are currently living under the tyranny of. It's hard. It's hard. School gardening was one of the jobs that I ran screaming from, honestly. But it wasn't because of the children at all. It was because working within the current system of education as it stands is nigh on impossible to do something that is so undervalued and that is so ornamental to them and so peripheral to the value system that is being proliferated by those who curate the curriculum and demand that certain things are taught, certain things are not, and you know, et cetera, et cetera. So my time working with young people was always better in the kind of more community settings, in the community centres, in the more intimate, in fact, in scenarios, and so I do think there is the capacity to cultivate an interest, a desire around the kind of gardening or growing or working outdoors. I just think that it has to exist within a system that values it, and unfortunately we're not within one of those. And so it is all on the margins where it's really doing that great work. And I say that because if you only have, which I often ended up with, 20 minutes with 20 pupils every term, like it was so hard to create kind of a meaningful engagement around that. Whereas even within the same school environment, I would do these classes with children with additional needs, and I would see them every 2 weeks, and we knew each other, and they knew what they'd sown, and they could watch it grow. Whereas if you only see a child 20 minutes every term, they'd forgotten what they'd done the term before. And so there are structural issues as to how we would integrate that kind of learning into the system that doesn't value it right now. But I mean, I am all for completely upending the way in which education is executed in this country and probably in other countries too. And there are examples of that being done incredibly well. I have a friend called Sarah who is working at a project called Grow in Barnet, I think Totteridge Academy, and the growing and the farming, it's literally farming. It's not like a tiny corner of a school playground. There's land and they are literally farming, and it is integrated into the education there, and it is really powerful. And so, yes, I do think it could be incredible and an amazing way to engage in wider issues, because growing is such an incredible lens through which you can have dialogues about the environment, about our interdependence, about the systems that sustain us. There are so many ways in which that history, and you know, there's all kinds of ways in which it can be imbued throughout the curriculum, but there has to be the will for it, unfortunately, and we don't live in a society that has it. Or, well, yes, no, we don't live in a society that has it, and I don't know I can't remember who the education minister is at the moment, but Gavin Williamson's terrible. And I don't think he's going to want to grow your own food in any of the schools that all of the schools that he oversees.
But also, like, their trajectory is what they believe to be forward always. So, like, some of these things existed in decades past, and now they are considered to be irrelevant. And, like, you know, so it's like, no, what is next? What is next? And that time span will just get smaller. And, you know, under this system. Sorry, it's bleak, but like it's just how many people can you cram in? How quickly can you move people towards like being a productive labour force ultimately?
I think in response to the eco-anxiety element of that question, in the recent years I've had opportunities to work with youth groups, like after-school groups, over the course of summers, every week or every 2 weeks. And the way that we would even begin to talk about intersectional climate justice would be to think about, okay, what do you experience in your everyday world about climate change, whether that's through the news or through like music, or through your social media accounts. Can we take this as like a plot summary of a story? So using kind of like speculative and science fictional tools of storytelling, can we take an article, for example, and plot what the characters are, and then plot what the storyline is, and what the conclusion is. And is the conclusion something that you trust? Is it something that you see yourself in as well? But if not, would you like to rewrite that conclusion? What would it take to change that narrative? And so to kind of give agency to young people, these were 14 to 19-year-olds, to kind of really kind of critically think about what's out there in this very oversaturated like world of media that's constantly just getting kind of, I guess, just there's so much of it that just replaces itself so quickly that it's hard to keep up with the current news of the changing climate and the changing power struggles within, you know, by a week-to-week thing. Even if you look at, you know, COP26 that happened, what kind of result is that for Indigenous in the Global South? So all of these, I guess, like topics within climate change that make up the climate justice angle is something that I think young people are very interested in. I think despite the eco-anxiety that they experience, by the overwhelm, once you break down these stories and you identify, again, the characters, the plots, the storylines, it's easier to then retell with your own position in it. And I think that's something that can be empowering. So one of the youth groups actually came out with a comic book, which was fantastic. So I hope that gives, you know, some of, a more kind of like positive and hopeful outlook as well.
Yeah, and also like even though the time we're living in is unique to now, like this isn't the first time people have been organising in times of conflict and in times of insecurity, and having to sort of like include young people and children in that, whether it's sort of, I don't know, thinking of like civil rights movements, organising, or like feminist movements in terms of organising the children and getting them involved and helping them understand the sort of like the anxieties that they might be going through. I think there are a lot of histories that we can kind of look to for that.
So I'd love to round this off and say a massive thank you to our guests this evening, Claire, Kathryn, Phoebe.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was really great.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.